Welcome, everyone, to our concluding episode of Return to Zion. And tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of recap the class as a whole. This is session or episode number, I think, 22. I'm not going to go into every little detail, but I'm kind of going to let's kind of go do a survey and put things in perspective. And also, we'll have some time for questions that still remain. Okay, so how did we start our class? Now, when we started our series, we kind of asked, what is redemption, right? What is redemption for the people returning from Zion? Because let's remember the circumstances of the returning exiles. First of all, again, when we read books, the biblical books written during the or reflecting the return to Zion, they tend to what we call the myth of the empty land. This idea that everyone in the land of Israel are the returning exiles from Babylon. And historians and archaeologists argue that that is not true, that there were, in fact, some Judeans who managed to continue in the land despite the fact that, there wasn't an official settlement, which we can understand because there were a lot of smaller communities. And the argument is that the census in the book of Ezra actually reflects that fact without kind of pointing it out. I was just reading there's a researcher named Jan Safford, Jan Jan, who actually just finished their doctorate, and they show and argue that there were Assyrian Jews who actually made it to Babylonia. In other words, there were Jews who were exiled, or Israelites, you could say, who were exiled with the Assyrian exile, and actually made their way to Babylon and possibly joined up with other with the Judean exiles there. But in other words, even the Assyrian exile, when we talk about the 10 lost tribes, is also not quite the way we picture it. And we also know, of course, that there were those who escaped the Assyrian exile by going down south to Judea. And we know that in terms of how Jerusalem kind of really expanded, even where you had a lot of people settling around the walls of Jerusalem, beyond the walls of Jerusalem. And one of the explanations of that expansion is that these were Assyrian exiles who managed to make it south to Judea. So we know that things are not quite so clear cut. And we know that in this situation, also, the land was not empty. How many, at this point, let's just call them Jews, how many Jews were in Judea and managed to continue in Judea despite the exile? That we don't know. Okay. How did they relate to the returning Jews from Babylon? Also, not 100% clear, right? And then there's the question of who, when we talk about the Samaritans, right? Who are these non-Jews who worship the Jewish God? Who are they exactly? And were there issues where returning Babylonian exiles thought that the people who had stayed were not actually Jews? It seems like that was perhaps a little bit less of an issue. It's certainly not addressed as such in the books, right? If we read Ezra and Nehemiah, it doesn't really seem to be that there's a big problem with people saying, no, we are actually Jews. Remember that the people who are rejected from building the temple are people who say, hey, we worship the same God, right? As opposed to saying, hey, we're actually you. At the same time, and this is what we were talking about in our recent classes, people came back. The problem is that we don't know, particularly because of the way Ezra and Nehemiah is kind of presenting it. We don't know what's happened with the people who stayed, and kind of one assumes at least tried to join up with the returning Babylonians. We don't know enough. There's a lot of conjecture. We can talk about the threat that was felt from the surrounding nations. And we talked about that a little in terms of, okay, while Ezra and Nehemiah Ezra, I should say, presented as this prevented the temple from being built, when we looked at Haggai, it looked like what really prevented the temple from being built was the tremendous poverty of the people. They simply didn't have the wherewithal to give of their resources and labor to build the temple when they themselves didn't have enough to eat. And Haggai speaks to that issue. And so while Cyrus allows people to return, he allows them to rebuild the temple. They do not, in fact, rebuild a temple, they rebuild an altar. So there's a functioning altar, but until the second year of Darius, in other words, they go through yet another king, who we call Cambyses. And then when we get into Darius, in the second year of Darius, that is when they finally rebuild. Note that when they do start to rebuild again, they can rebuild without too much threat from the surrounding nations. They can rebuild the temple, but they cannot rebuild the city. They are forbidden from rebuilding the city because the surrounding nations find this tremendously threatening, and frankly, so does the Persian king. Until Nehemiah is able to get permission to rebuild the city from due to his special status with the emperor, and then they're able to rebuild the city. We see from the Psalms that we looked at just how important Zion, namely the city of Jerusalem, is to the returning Judeans. How important it is to build the city of Jerusalem, to have this as a capital. This is in a way the symbol of the redemption. And that brings us back to our initial question: what is the redemption that everyone's been yearning for? Is the redemption simply the return to the land, and with a level of autonomy that we are given in terms of the Persian Empire? Is that the redemption? Does the redemption require, one assumes it requires rebuilding the temple, is that enough? Is it enough to rebuild the city? From Nehemiah's point of view, the point of view is to rebuild the city. And again, we can see from the Mizmorim, from the Psalms, how important Sion, rebuilding Zion, was, and how big a theme that is in terms of this is what we yearn for. We yearn for Zion. We yearn for Jerusalem. At the same time, is this enough? Is this enough? Right? Malachi talks about how can the wicked prosper? So there has to be some kind of day of the Lord, and that we're drawing from earlier prophecies where you have the day of God, which is this big either apocalyptic battle or a judgment, right? Because Malachi presents it more as judgment. Zechariah, right? When I'm not showing you all this inside because we've done it inside. Zechariah has several different visions, right? On the one hand, we saw the vision in Zechariah Chet, in Zechariah 8, that vision of natural bounty. Now, you will have children and old people in the squares and the wide places of Jerusalem, right? That vision, that is the redemption, right? That ability that you have people you're able to, first of all, they're healthy, they're alive, and also these are people who don't work, and they are able to live and thrive in Jerusalem. We have that much bounty and wealth and safety, right? We're able to live in safety. For in Zechariah, even without walls, God will be the walls, right? That we can live in safety, and this is the vision. At the same time, then we go to Zechariah Yud Bet and Zechariah Yud Daled, Zechariah 12 and 14, where we have this tremendous apocalyptic battle, right? Where we have the nations, where half of the city is sent out, where women are raped. It's a horrible vision, a horrible, horrible battle over Jerusalem, right? But which ends with this kind of ultimate kind of redemption and victory over the surrounding nations, and is above nature, right? Supernatural, apocalyptic redemption. And then that brings us also to, who are we hoping to rule? Are we hoping for a Mashiach, a Messiah? And that's what we see in Zechariah and in Haggai when they talk about Zerubbabel, right? Zerubbabel is going to be the Davidic king. He's going to be the Messianic Davidic king. He, alongside Yoshua, who will be the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, they will rule, and this will bring in the redemption, right? Or, as we have in 2nd Isaiah, God will rule. We don't need a person to rule. In the redemptive age, God will rule us. And these are different visions that people have for the redemption. And in fact, if you're living in the world that Ezra and Nehemiah kind of describes for you, where you are living in the Persian Empire, and your ruler is a Pekah, is a governor from the Persian Empire. He's ruling alongside, there is a high priest, right? Priests are important, but you have this kind of governor. It's easier perhaps to see the redemption in terms of God is ruling, right? If that's what you're hoping for, that's in a way an easier political thing to hope for, that God will rule directly. But we see these kind of competing visions of what redemption means. And is this it? Is what we're living in now, this natural time, is this the redemption, right? Is this what we were promised? And again, we have in the biblical books themselves, whereas if we're just reading Haggai and Zechariah, it sounds like there's got to be this Messianic age brought in with Zerubbabel as the Messiah, as Mashiach. If we read Ezra and Nehemiah, this is it. This is what God promised, right? End of 70 years. This is what God promised. This is the redemption. We have our temple, and under Nehemiah, we even have our city, and we have some autonomy, and we are in our land. This is what we want. And yet, even in Ezra and Nehemiah, we looked at Nehemiah 10, Nehemiah 9, and we saw that there they say, and yet we are slaves. We and our animals are slaves to these kings who rule over us, essentially from afar. So we still see that even within the Persian period, there were times when the Jews felt tremendously under threat, right? They felt under threat. They felt enslaved. They felt that they were, in fact, not in control of their own land and of their own peoplehood, essentially. That transition in the Second Temple period is going to prepare the way for the Hasmonean kingdom, because there's this idea that we should be ruling, and yet we're being ruled by this far off empire, right? So under the Persian period, it still mostly seems okay. Once there's actual friction, there is absolutely, you can already see this idea that specifically in Ezra, in Nehemiah 10, in Nehemiah 9, this idea that we should not be under a foreign king. We should not be under a foreign king. This in some way enslaves us. Now, other questions that are being kind of figured out at this time are also questions of identity. The returnees come back with classes that we're not even really familiar with, right? You've got singers, you have Nethinim, you have the descendants of Solomon's slaves or servants, right? Different classes of people who serve in the temple, the gatekeepers, and they've kept these records in some way that they now are ready to kind of fulfill their place in the temple. At least this is the way that Ezra and Nehemiah is telling it. Okay. So you have these different classes of people coming back, and some of them, and while it's Ezra and Nehemiah, these are all different classes of people who seem to be Jews. So we talked about specifically the Nethinim, because the Nethinim continue on as a class even into the rabbinic period, right? Where the Nethinim in this period are considered people with a role in the temple, who seem to descend not from Jews, but from people who were temple servants, and yet at this point are considered part of the kahal. They're considered part of the community, and they, alongside all the Jews, are told, no, you should not take foreign wives. If you take foreign wives, you should separate from them. They're part of the community. They're just another class of these Jews, specifically Jews who serve in the temple. And yet we saw from what Yechezkel says, and Yechezkel on the one hand, where Ezekiel said, in the future, remember he's speaking right around the time of the destruction, right? In the future, non-Jews will not serve in the temple. You're like, who is he referring to? And it seems like perhaps he's referring to these Nethinim and these descendants of Shlomo's slaves or servants. And at the same time, Isaiah specifically says, the second Isaiah specifically says, the non-Jew who has essentially joined the worship of God, he can serve in my temple. And we see how that plays out later on in the rabbinic period, where the Nethinim have a specific class. They're kind of this in-between class. In the Mishnah, they're a class who belong kind of to the wider Jewish people, but they can't marry anyone they want. And then in the Talmud, they have to explain this. Why can't they marry anyone they want, or nearly anyone they want, like a regular convert? And they say, well, they must be descended from the Gibeonim, the Gibeonites, who were not merciful enough to be fully accepted into the people, right? So that's the explanation. But we see that as we looked at, converts become, as the Second Temple period continues, converts become a much more standard part of the Jewish people, where there's a way to convert and where converts are expected and part of the Jewish people. And the only people they can't marry are priests. We see tension in that. On the one hand, where in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have a text called Forcu Florilegium, which talks about how essentially it seems like they can't join can't join the community or can't enter the temple, converts. And in the temple scroll, also connected to the Qumran community, converts can enter the temple, but only up to a certain, only the Ezrat Nashim, only where women can go, right? And yet we know that in the rabbinic period, converts are Jews, right? They can go pretty much wherever they want. We see in the Second Temple period how there are more and more, not I should say more and more, but we see in different places, different ways that people are converting and joining the Jewish people, to the point where Juvenal in his satires talks about a father in his part on kind of bad parenting and children who kind of go astray in a way. He talks about how here there's this father and he starts keeping the Sabbath, and then his son and not eating pork. And then for his son wouldn't even touch pork, would be like eating a person. And then his son gets circumcised, right? And that's it. Like then they're Jews. Like, watch your parenting, buddy. We see that this is becoming more of a thing to join the Jewish people. And so we see this kind of negotiation of identity. And I'll remind you that when we look at kind of separating from the foreign wives in Ezra and Nehemiah, so Ezra talks about it very much as, you are sinning and you're going to get us kicked out of the land again. And Nehemiah talks about it very much in terms of, we are losing our peoplehood because they're marrying, let's say, Ashdodi women, and their children can only speak Ashdodi. In other words, their children are not members of our group. They're members of the Ashdodi, the Philistine group. And so this is a real threat to us as a people. Or I don't know if he talks about it so much as in terms of a threat, but this is a problem. We looked at, and we also looked at, and this kind of ties together, we looked at the end of prophecy and we looked at leadership in this period. So when I say the end of prophecy, what do I mean, right? So there are prophets. We start with some very strong prophets. Haggai and Zechariah are pointed to as the reason that people start to build in this time, that they're really urging the building of the temple, and people follow them. These are prophets that people actually listen to. At the same time, we have the prophecy in Zechariah that talks about how in the future, people won't be prophets. Even people who are prophesying will deny that they're prophesying. They'll be ashamed to be considered themselves prophets. The question is, why? Why? And what it seems to be, what I proposed, is that in this period, people have stopped believing in prophets as a default. Rather than being a default, being a prophet comes to you with a prophecy, and you say, oh, why should I not believe him? I mean, obviously, he's a prophet. I obviously should believe. The default becomes not believing. And we see this with Nehemiah, that he has prophets coming up to him, and he's like, you're lying. You're all misleading me. You're trying to get me into trouble. And he calls them prophets, right? He names a prophetess. He calls them prophets. It doesn't matter from his point of view. They've been bought out. And so the default of prophecy has become a denial rather than belief. What has allowed that to happen? What's allowed that to happen is the Torah. In this period, what we saw was that people have become to rely on a written Torah, right? They bring Ezra forward. Ezra reads from the written law. People are acting like they've never heard these rules before. And for the first time, we see biblical interpretation going on, right? They've got a written text. They've got problems in the written text. We looked at that. And they're trying to reconcile them. Once you have a written law, you can draw from that law instead of relying on oral prophets. Also, we have leaders fulfilling the role that prophets used to have. What do I mean? If we look at what Nehemiah does, if we look at what Ezra does, what would we have had in the let's talk the old days for a second. Let's talk about the kings of Israel. Let's talk about good ones, right? David, right? Or even like guys, ones who started out good and kind of messed up, like Saul, right? Shaul doesn't give religious directives to his people. Who gives religious directives to the people? Shmuel, Samuel, the prophet that is alongside him. Similarly, David he kind of dances on the line, but for the most part, David is the king. Religious directives are not going to come from him. They're going to come through prophecy. Maybe prophecy to him, but generally through prophecy, that's how religious directives are going to come to the people. Once we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, what do we see? We see that Ezra says, oh, everyone is sinning, and he starts fasting, and he starts crying, what's going to happen? We're going to get kicked out. And everyone's like, oh no, Ezra, oh no, we'll listen to you, right? And they listen to Ezra. Nehemiah says, you're pulling people into servitude. This is wrong. This is morally wrong. And he goes to the leaders, and they're like, you're right, this is morally wrong. We have the actual leaders are now fulfilling the role of religious and moral leaders. Something that we had, certainly in Moshe we have it, right? In Moses we have that, right? So I'm not saying that it's unprecedented, but in the standard way that you have rulers, even if we look at the Shoftim, the judges, for the most part, these are military, usually frequently military rulers, and they're not meant to be the religious rulers, right? And so we have with Nehemiah and Ezra, we start seeing this kind of religious leadership that's going hand in hand with what we would consider secular leadership, right? They are they're the pecha, they're the governor, and yet they're doing things so that the Jews keep the laws of God, right? Nehemiah physically makes sure that merchants cannot come into the city on Shabbat, right? He makes sure it's not going to happen. And that's when we start seeing leadership that on the one hand can be simply an exercise of power, like we say with Nehemiah, when he throws out his rival's stuff from the lishkah, from the chamber within the temple. He just physically throws it out, or physically stops merchants from coming to sell wares on Shabbat. And we also see an appeal to what at this point everyone accepts as the law or as general guidance. There are shared values at this point that leaders can call on. Ezra does this and Nehemiah does this. Ezra does this when he fasts and cries out and says, oh, we're going to be kicked out. Nehemiah does it with the debt slavery. He says, you are doing a bad thing. We had to redeem slaves in Babylon, and now you're creating slaves. What are you doing? And they can say, oh, you are right. We are wrong. We will do what you say. And so at this point, because we've got to the point where there's an accepted Torah, it not just in terms of a written law, but an accepted code of conduct and moral conduct, these leaders are able to be both secular and religious leaders calling on this shared code. And that's something that really typifies the Second Temple period, the Torah, right? This acceptance of we can call on a Torah that we all rely on. And we saw that in the Psalms as well, because there are wisdom Psalms. There are Psalms that simply talk about learning the Torah, talks about the importance of the Torah, however you are defining what the Torah means, right? And so we see this, and it's going to continue in the Second Temple period, particularly as we see, and this we didn't learn together, but Philo, I brought some of Philo when we were talking about converts. Philo is a Jew living in Alexandria in around 40 of the Common Era, so before the destruction, but quite late in the Second Temple period. And he talks about what do people do on Shabbat? They all come together essentially to the synagogue, and they learn the law. That's what they do all day. And this idea of let's learn it, in their case, probably not learning the Torah in Hebrew, learning the Septuagint in Greek, learning what we call now the Old Greek translation. In other words, the translation of the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, right? Those books are now going to be central to Second Temple Jewry, to their thought, to everything they do in written form. And in fact, when we look at kind of the secondary literature of this period, think books like Jubilees, books like Enoch, they are books like the Genesis Apocryphon. They are reworkings and interpretations of these same books, where a lot of the creative output of the Jews in this period is based on the Torah and interpreting the Torah and doing and writing midrashim on the Torah and writing allegorical interpretations of the Torah and getting to all sorts of different corners that we wouldn't necessarily expect them to in terms of what they're writing, but still using this as kind of their jumping off point in its written form. So this was our class on Return to Zion. And thank you for joining me for it. And I'd love to hear any questions or comments based on what I've just kind of laid out.
Miriam?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go for it.
The idea that on Shabbat you shouldn't do business,
Yes.
is there any evidence that existed before the time of, it was Nehemiah that enforced it?
Yirmiyahu for sure talks about it. So yes, that the idea that you don't do work on Shabbat is absolutely earlier than the idea that you don't sell things on Shabbat, that sort of, is exists before Nehemiah, right?
It actually exists before the destruction of the first temple.
Yes, this is not the first time we see the idea. We see it very clearly. Yes, here we are. This is what I was thinking of. Okay. So if we see here. Okay. Here we are. Hishamru b'nafshotechem. I'm reading from Yirmiyahu Yud Zayin Chaf Aleph, Jeremiah 17:21. All right. Ko amar Hashem, Hishamru b'nafshotechem ve'al tis'u masa b'yom HaShabbat v'aveitim b'sharei Yerushalayim. V'lo totziu masa mibatechem b'yom HaShabbat v'chol melacha lo ta'asu v'kidashtem et yom HaShabbat kasher tziviti et avotechem. Now you can read this another way. You can say, you're not allowed. So guard your lives and don't bring a burden on the day of Shabbat into the gates of the city. And don't bring a burden from your homes on the day of Shabbat, and do not do any labor. Okay, so what is it referring to? You could say, well, it's simply referring to the rule that you're not allowed to carry, right? But it's pretty clear that what he's referring to is exactly what Nehemiah was talking about, right? The pshat, the plain meaning of the verse, is don't bring stuff into the gates of Jerusalem, right? Don't bring things through the gates. Why are you bringing burdens through the gates on Shabbat in order to sell it? So it really seems like it's talking about the same case that Nehemiah is talking about. Nehemiah is much clearer, right? Like we had to interpret the verse in Yirmiyahu and Jeremiah according to what we saw in Nehemiah, even though it seems pretty clear what it's talking about. But it absolutely seems pretty clear that people knew that on Shabbat, buying and selling were considered labor that you weren't allowed to do. Now, also, it's kind of the plain meaning of labor. Normally, the way we think about working, buying and selling would be working.
I missed, you made the transition around Philo talking about studying Torah on Shabbat. I didn't get the connection that you were making between the shift away from prophecy and secular leaders playing the moral.
And it was a big shift. I was simply saying that the Torah, the written Torah, becomes very, very central as we move through the Second Temple. So that whereas in the First Temple period, rather than pointing to a written Torah, prophets are saying, don't do this, don't do that, right? And I'm not saying did the Torah exist, didn't exist. That's not the issue. The issue is that people aren't pointing to a written Torah that everyone has access to. Once we get to Philo in 40 to the Common Era, everyone has access, right? Everyone, the idea of what does it mean from Philo's perspective? What does it mean to be a Jew? You on Shabbat, you are going to the synagogue and you are learning the law all day. That's a big part of what it means to be a Jew, right? So whereas before, you wouldn't be pointing to a written text, here people are pointing to a written text. We really see that early on, where there's this desire to kind of, again, reconcile text, to do biblical interpretation. We see that when Ezra reads from the Torah, and again, when Ezra reads from the Torah, it's presented as something new. People had not heard this before. Once we get, hundreds of years later, once we get to Philo, everyone knows the 5 books, right? Whether in Hebrew or in Greek, right? We've moved on from this being something that when Ezra's reading it, people are discovering holidays they didn't know about, right? And yet, when they do the holiday, it's clear that they're interpreting the verses, right? So there's a biblical interpretation going on, and that biblical interpretation becomes the creative engine for much of what we have of what's written in the Second Temple period.
As far as we know, is the concept of the Tanakh in the days of Philo basically what we see in the Septuagint?
Okay, so we absolutely have what they call the tripartite canon. In other words, we have Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, right? The Torah, the prophets, and the writings. We have that idea by the time we get to Philo, for sure, right?
Is that the Septuagint?
Okay, no. If Philo is talking about the Septuagint, he means the Greek interpretation, the Greek translation of the 5 books of Moses. That doesn't mean he doesn't have access to the rest of it. He has access to the rest of it. But when someone like Philo talks about the Septuagint, let's put it this way: the translation that was miraculously created, because there's a whole story about how this Greek translation is authoritative, right? So the story around the Septuagint is that miraculously the 70 or 72, depending on the story, rabbis who interpret the Bible translate the Bible into Greek, miraculously all come up with the same translation. And so it was divinely inspired, right? The translation itself has a gushpanka, has a divine authoritative nature.
Does Philo relate to that miracle?
Yeah, 100% Philo relates to that. Philo needs to relate to that, because what Philo does is he takes the Greek words, and he says, and that's why Moses calls them a proselyte, because they're coming, he interprets the Greek words as if the Greek word came out of Moshe's mouth. That's how he interprets them. And he explains the reason he can do that is because the Greek translation itself was divine, because it was created miraculously. So because of that, Philo explains, he can interpret these words are as if Moses himself spoke them in the Greek. So he actually interprets Greek words as if that's what Moshe said. And he'll say, and Moshe used the word such and such, and he's used to talk about the Greek words. Did Philo know Hebrew? That is the question. He probably didn't. Probably not. But we don't know for sure if he may have known some. But he had like a kind of a list. He had Hebrew word lists. Like he had access to that. But did he actually know Hebrew? He interprets the Greek.
So first of all, do we know that the majority or all of them actually did follow that observance of Torah? And
wait, who are you talking about now? Do we know that all of whom?
The people.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, clearly not. I mean, look, you have,
But
this
it's
is the
never
thing.
true.
So what did people keep? What did people not keep? People certainly, there's an argument about, was there an orthodoxy in the Second Temple period? I think there was, was there any sort of orthodoxy? Or do we have to talk about Judaisms? I think there was an orthodoxy, and there were breakaway groups. I don't think the orthodoxy in the Second Temple period is the orthodoxy today, right? And I don't think it's functioned the same way either. I think by definition, as long as we have the temple standing, there's a practice that's going on in the temple. Someone's controlling the temple. Is it the Stokim or the Pushim, the Sadducees or the Pharisees? That can change, but whoever's controlling it, there's a certain orthodoxy of practice there, first of all. So first of all, you have some orthodoxy of practice happening in the temple. Second of all, there's certain things that everyone does. Everyone is expected to do as a Jew. Everyone is expected to keep some form of Shabbat. Everyone is expected to keep some form of kosher. Everyone is expected to keep some form of ritual purity. These are things that distinguish Jews. And if a Jew doesn't do it, then that's a Jew who's not doing the things that he's supposed to be doing as a Jew. That doesn't mean that everyone is doing it, but that means that there is a certain expectation. For example, if you talk about purity, the tremendous number of mikvaot that we have during the Second Temple period, right? So we see that this becomes a very important thing to Jews. We also see in terms of what do Romans say about Jews? Romans say they're very lazy. They have every seventh day off. What is this, right? So there are certain things that people, they got circumcised. That's also, I forgot about circumcision is a very important thing. Like, they don't eat pig. Who are these crazy people, right? So non-Jews know the Jews keep certain things. And those are very standard practices. Then you get into the fine tuning, right? So if you look and see what in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's that document, Miksat Maseh Torah, where they say, this is why we separated out from the temple. And it's these very fine-tuned halakhic issues, right? It's how do we think that liquid purity is transferred? Now, they're talking about temple practice, right? But they're very kind of fine-tuned issues. Then if you look in the Damascus document, the introduction, when it talks about where do we disagree, there are some bigger issues in terms of can you marry your niece, right? You can't marry your aunt, but can you marry your niece, right? They're like, no, you can't. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea Text says, obviously you can't. When it says you can't marry your aunt, it means you can't marry your uncle also, obviously. The Dead Sea Text says, and the Pharisees say, no, it's fine, right? So that's an argument that's maybe a more basic argument, right? So there's some more basic arguments, and the whole issue of the calendar. There are other bigger arguments, but still, we have kind of a basic, everyone's keeping Shabbat, right? Everyone's keeping some form of kashrut. Everyone's keeping some form of purity. People are still, most of them, coming to sacrifice or worship at the temple. There are things that, and then there are different fine-tuned things that we see differences, and people are arguing about. So I do think that's kind of silly to talk about as if there's no orthodoxy whatsoever. There isn't an orthodoxy the way that I know there's a Catholic Orthodox. There's the priest, there's a central control in terms of the temple. And then the question is, how far does that central control expand to? It's interesting that we have the story in Pesach Habakkuk where the Dead Sea sect says, hey, remember that Yom Kippur when the wicked priest came down and tried to make us eat on our Yom Kippur. And the way we understand that today is that it was a Yom Kippur according to the sect, but it was not Yom Kippur according to the orthodoxy in the temple. And it bothered the high priest enough that someone was sent down there to say, guys, this isn't Yom Kippur. It's not Yom Kippur, eat. Doesn't sound like it worked. But the question is, okay, so that's clearly actually an attempt at central control. How far did it extend? Because Qumran is not that far from Jerusalem. But the fact is, there was some kind of orthodoxy. Philo is, as a religious Jew, and when Philo writes to his nephew, who he sees as kind of crossing the line, he sees his nephew essentially kind of going off to be essentially Roman, right? And he sees that as a line you can cross. In other words, don't stop being a Jew. Like, he writes a whole treatise for his nephew so that his nephew won't leave. And that indicates that there is a line also. That, in other words, there is absolutely a Jewish identity and an idea of you need to do these things to be a Jew.
Miriam?
Yes.
In the story of Hanukkah, the revolt of the Maccabees, can this be understood as a battle for this orthodoxy?
Okay. So the Maccabees is even more than that, because it is political. It's not the same sort of orthodoxy as we have later. So pre-Hasmonean, what do we see in terms of an orthodoxy? We see, for example, Ben Sira. Ben Sira is writing during the Ptolemaic period it's around 200 BCE. So he's writing like a generation, let's say, above that, or a generation or two before the Hasmoneans. And he reads very much like something that's written between the Torah and the Mishnah. I remember reading him and feeling very comfortable. In other words, it's not weird. He writes in a way that you're like, yeah, this is between the Torah and the Mishnah. I get everything that he's saying. Again, I wouldn't want to be his wife or his daughter, but everything kind of keeps with, in kind of the Jewish law and the way we used to thinking about things. He doesn't go deep into halacha, it's a wisdom work, but it kind of works with kind of what we're familiar with. The Hasmoneans, what you have is kind of a combination of you had political disagreements within Jerusalem, right? Where you have certain people buying the priesthood, and that one buying the priesthood being a Hellenizer in a way that other people were not going to tolerate, and then the emperor coming down hard because he read something or the king coming down hard because he read something as a rebellion when it was simply a rebellion against the local ruler. So it was, I don't know if it was you could say orthodoxy, because I don't think that maybe you could say it was orthodoxy the way I defined it. In other words, basic orthodoxy. We don't want idols in the temple, right? We want to keep Shabbat. We want to learn our law. We want to circumcise our sons. Those basic things were threatened with the decrees. The decrees of Antiochus Epiphanes threatened these basic parts of being a Jew and keeping kosher, for example, right? These were things, specific things. Idol worship, not worshiping idols, or sacrificing to idols, or sacrificing to the emperor, or not eating pig, keeping kosher, and circumcision. All these things, these were what the decrees were against, right? The decrees were against the specific things that made Jews Jews. Those laws. So yes, it was. It's not. This isn't like made up. This was in fact a war for that. It was also a war because there was already a belief that really the people of Israel should rule Israel as kings. They should not be under a foreign king, right? You already have this idea. And so both of those things work together. I think that it started absolutely being something, I think it worked together. On the one hand, we should have an independent rule of our kingdom, of our land, but also very much it started with these are our laws. This is what we need to keep, right? It's and the idea of the importance of keeping the law is something we see in both First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. First Maccabees, where there is essentially a town that sacrifices themselves because they won't fight on Shabbat, right? They won't fight on Shabbat, and so they die, right? And then they say, listen, we've got to fight on Shabbat. If we don't fight on Shabbat, we've already lost, because they'll just attack us on Shabbat and we're all dead. So we must be able to fight on Shabbat. But the fact is that the law is super important. Why am I talking about First Maccabees and not Second Maccabees? First Maccabees is the less flowery account, right? Second Maccabees, which was written in Greek by someone in the diaspora, is actually much more, has miracles and martyrs, and it's very flowery. First Maccabees is much more, just like it's much closer to a straight account. And yet you see how important the law was in terms of what are we fighting for, right? What we need to keep the law. We can't not keep the law. Whereas with Second Maccabees, you have the story of Miriam and her 7 sons, or Hannah and her 7 sons, where each of them essentially sacrifices themselves rather than either worshiping idols. There's also an old man who refuses to eat something that's not kosher. So there are a lot of martyrs there for the law. And the question is, the stories absolutely seem to be kind of, romanticized stories, but they're meant to reflect what was supposed to be going on. So you have the political side again, but in First Maccabees, it's much straighter. But even there, you see how important keeping laws were, and how central that was in the whole Hasmonean rebellion.
So going back to the First Temple period.
Yes.
We don't seem to have, is there like a central awareness of a Torah? Is what's the unified principle for Jews in the First Temple period?
Well, that's the question. The question is there absolutely are unifying laws. Like there are laws that everyone's keeping, right? And that's what people argue about today, right? So today everyone argues about, did they have was the Torah, was it oral for the most part? Like it again, you have these stories of, oh, well, suddenly they're keeping Pesach. Suddenly they like of rediscovering things, right? You have this, especially for example with Yoshiyahu, he finds the book in the temple, and now we're not keeping it. Oh no, right? And right, so there's this idea of they don't have access. They don't have access to a law code the way they do later on, right? What they do have access to are prophets, right? And there are absolutely things that everyone should know not to do, right? They're not supposed to eat meat with blood, right? That's the story of when Shaul says no one can eat, and then everyone's so hungry when Shaul says no one, they're routing the Philistines and they're winning, and Shaul says no one can eat until they're gone. And Yonatan eats honey because he hasn't heard about it. And then they say, "Oh no, you're not allowed to eat honey." And he's like, "Oh, what a stupid rule!" And because poor Shaul is always making mistakes. And then in fact we know that it's a mistake because they're so hungry when they win that they eat the meat on the blood, right? And we know that that's bad, right? So there are things that everyone knows are bad. So one assumes that in terms of things that everyone would keep, like kosher, like Shabbat, right? Those are things that would be anything that would be obvious and in view, one would assume would be kept as kind of whether or not you have the law code in your hand, like whether or not you can point to it, right? I'm not saying the Torah wasn't there. I'm just saying that people didn't have regular access to the Torah the same way. Right? They didn't have the same access to the written Torah that they have in the Second Temple period. They just don't. Right? You can
They
see
would
it
have
from the
been
way
familiar with the
people are.
general ideas.
Yes. Yes.
Yep.
And it's the same way if you like a lot of like essentially people who don't learn, what do they keep, right? And this is just as an aside, because you want to say like, what do people keep? What's the last thing people give up when they become not so religious or they're not learning so much? So it's always interesting that Ashkenazim, one of the first things that goes is Tarat Mishpacha, right? They don't even know about it, right? Practically, right? They're not going to mikvah. Sephardim are not like that. They absolutely, you have non-religious Sephardi women and they go to mikvah, okay? And part of the reason is because mikvah for Sephardim is a public thing. They all go, then when she's getting married, they all know about it. Whereas for Ashkenazim, as a girl, I never knew if my mother went to the mikvah. It's a secret. It's very, very private, right? So any Ashkenazi is not it's not something you see, right? So if it's a practice that everyone sees that this is what we do because God wants us to do this, then that's something that's going to continue. And then you have these situations where a prophet is calling people back. So for example, when Sidkiyahu, they freed the slaves and then they restored, then they after that they should have freed because it was after 6 years, and then they took them back. And Yirmiyahu has this whole prophecy about how you're going to get it because you took the slaves back, right? And it's like, what was going on? Should they have just been keeping the law? The answer was apparently not. Apparently they weren't just keeping the law. And one of the theories is that one of the reasons they freed the slaves was because it was at a time when there was a siege and it was hard for them to even support the slaves. So they freed them. Remember, we're talking about really indentured servants, right? So they freed them. And then once things loosened up, they took them back, right? And Yirmiyahu saw it as, okay, they freed them. And they probably said, "Oh, we're freeing them because we're keeping the law." And then now we can afford them, and we wanted them back, and they took them back. So the question is, why do you need a prophet? And the answer is because they're not keeping the law the same way. As an interesting aside, since you brought this up, I'm just going to say this. This was really cool. There was a papyrus that they discovered from right before Mary Bar Kokhba, right before the Bar Kokhba revolt. And it's talking about the lawyers on the Roman side. They're kind of strategizing how they need to address a court case on these two Jews who did something to avoid taxes. Okay. So the two Jews were doing this whole thing to avoid taxes on freeing a slave. They were freeing the slave and they didn't want to pay the 6% that you had to pay to free a slave. Right. So they did this thing with their two guys in Arabia where they pretended that they sold it in Arabia so that they could say, so that in each court they could say we paid taxes in the other court. And so they were bringing them to trial. what was going on? Why did they need to get what? There are two theories of what was going on. One theory is there was pidyon shvuyim, that they were redeeming, in fact, redeeming, a Jewish slave who had been taken from somewhere else. The other theory is that they were trying to keep the 6 years. They had taken a Jewish slave, quote unquote, and they wanted to free him after 6 years, but they didn't want to have, and they wanted to keep the Jewish law, right? But they didn't want to have to pay 6% every time the 6-year thing came up. For the Romans, the Roman Empire, you have a slave forever. So you free a slave, so you pay 6%. Every 6 years, they didn't want to pay 6%. So they're trying to avoid it, right? So that's a theory that they're trying to be, okay with Jewish law and work somehow with imperial Roman law. So we see that again in the Second Temple period, it's a whole different, the laws are much more widely understood, known, applied. We still see that Nehemiah, for example, had to continually work to make sure people were keeping Shabbat and not selling stuff on Shabbat. So it's not like, everyone was some kind of righteous tzaddik, keeping everything, but there was a much more general understanding of this is what we need to do.
So I have one quick question.
Yes.
The greater access to the Torah in the second period, was that because there were more Sifrei Torah made, or because the Jews were literate, or both?
I think both. I think both. There's a big question of how literate Jews were in the First Temple period, with the arguments on both sides. But certainly, yes, that they were writing more and that they were reading more is pretty clear. And so again, you have the fact that you have copies. You need to have to look at it, especially for biblical interpretation, where you're interpreting two texts that don't really work together. You kind of need the written text. And we see that people had access to it. Obviously, one assumes that there were some who simply did not read the text, but anyone who was more of a thinker was going to be reading the text. And again, the fact that we have from early on, we have this translation into Greek, which meant all the Jews who couldn't read Hebrew in the diaspora could read it in Greek and learn it that way. Just the fact that you had multiple copies and multiple versions even of the Septuagint in Greek shows just how much the Jews were studying and copying this text.
Would other people, other non-Jews, also have been increasing how much they wrote and read, or was this a Jewish thing?
Oh, I think non-Jews were also. In fact, there's a theory. I was just talking to Jonathan Bendov about this. He's working on it. There's that he was like, how do we have? So the Masoretic text is much more conservative than the other versions, right? So there we have the Proto-Samaritan and Proto-Septuagint, which apparently are now related. They're harmonistic. They try to make things work. They'll create the missing verses, whereas the Masoretic text leaves in the difficult words. It leaves in places where we're missing a verse. It doesn't fix things as much. So why do we have this version that is so conservative? And he thinks that it's actually parallel, and I kept on jumping to the Masoretes, but the Masoretes are in 600 CE. It's parallel to the whole, in Athens and at Alexandria, they had a whole attempt to get to the Homeric ore text, right? They wanted to get to the original Homer, right? So it was a whole class of activity to get to the original Homer, right? And he said, and so also there was a parallel movement in Judea to which used kind of some of the same rules of saying, no, we're not going to fix this. We want the original. So we're going to keep it, pristine, even if it's harder, right? And that it was a similar, so there were things going on in the non-Jewish world as well in terms of writing and copying. I don't know enough in terms of, how parallel the actual number of copies of things were, for example. But if you would talk about Alexandria, you have the Library of Alexandria and stuff like that. Philo is in an intellectual center. So that's kind of special. But in Judea, there's a lot of reading, writing, and reworking the Torah, just looking at the Torah and interpreting, and also the prophets, but especially the Torah.
If we go back to the First Temple period, I think there is a controversy among historians and archaeologists as to how monotheistic were the Judeans and the Israelites, with most secular and archaeologists and historians convinced that the answer is not so much. That the belief was, yes, that there was definitely a belief in a Hebrew God as our God and the greatest God, but not necessarily the exclusive God.
Yeah, I mean, you see that in biblical text also. You see in biblical text, God, like, references to kind of God is the greatest of the, like, there's a reference to different things where you can see that there are some underlying beliefs of at least some people. And also, not just that. If you think of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, God is one. Why wouldn't God be one? Why would God not be one? What beliefs is it talking about? Now, we always think about it in terms of Christianity. Christianity has the Trinity. We're saying, no, it's not the Trinity. But there was no Christianity. What Trinity, right? What does that mean God is one? The answer is the same way we have that inscription, the God who is in done, right? The Yud-K Vav-K who is in done. So you had, no, the answer is no, the Lord is not the Lord in Dan and the Lord in Bethel and the Lord in Jerusalem. You're not, I say, Yud-K Vav-K in Jerusalem, Yud-K Vav-K in Dan, Yud-K Vav-K in Bethel. There's clearly that attitude from some people. And Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad says, no, it's one God. This isn't, this one it's not connected to that place or this place or the other place. There's one Yud-K Vav-K, right? There's one God in terms of that. Like, then even before we get to polytheism, right?
Maria?
Yes.
I never understood how that's presented as a conflict or a contradiction between the archaeological record and what's recorded in the Tanakh. All of the Nevi'im, all the way from Shoftim until the Nevi'im Achronim, are all saying the people are all worshiping foreign gods. The people
100%.
The kings are worshiping foreign gods.
Moshe,
everyone's worshiping foreign gods.
Moshe, I am with you. I always felt the same way. I'm like, people are like, ooh, this is supposed to like shock you. And like, I'm like, I've been reading the text. The text was telling me that everyone was having this problem, right? That people were worshiping Baal, that people were worshiping, whoever they could worship, hey, it's now, we need rain now, we're going to worship Baal. Like that, we see it in the text. So thank you everyone for joining me. And I'm looking forward to see you in our next series, whatever it is. Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye-bye. Thank you.